How you doing, Canada? So, you probably, if this goes viral like I'm hoping it will, but it probably won't. But who cares, right? Yeah, so I'm making this video about the place of God in our legal system. Uh, and my first premise is that's not up for debate. The legal system that we have inherited is founded on the supremacy of God. And so at issue is how the current generation of legal practitioners have essentially conspired against deity. So, a little bit of background on Canada and our legal system here. As I'm sure you're aware, the British North America Act of 1867 was kind of the first document that we used to confederate between Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and the Maritime provinces, and then, of course, the eventual expansion all the way out to British Columbia. The British North America Act recognizes the Queen of England as the official head of state for Canada. And as we all know, monarchs rule by what is called divine right. As in, for whatever reason, God has made that person the monarch, their family is the monarch, so on and so forth. So that's point number one specific to Canada. Point number two is the 1929 Persons case, which is, of course, where Canada was recognized as having its own distinct legal tradition from Mother England in the ruling from, I believe it was the Privy Council in England, that stated Canada has its own living tree of the law. So that's a key point because women gained the right to vote and to be recognized as equal persons, and in the same token, we were given the clear statement that we have our own living tree of the law here in Canada. At issue is the damage that has been done to the living tree of the law. And so my client, God, for the purpose of this thought experiment, and I'm actually potentially going to file this. I'm not sure if I'll recognize the authority of a court system that has become unmoored from its foundations, but I have to consider that a little bit more for myself. But essentially, when people conspire against what the legal system is founded on, that there has to be some type of restitution made for that. And so I think kind of reasserting that the Canadian legal practice is founded on the supremacy of God is critical. And I think, you have a lot of atheistic people who have inserted themselves into the legal profession, quite unethically, I might add. And the reason why that's unethical is because you're practicing law in a system founded on the supremacy of a God in which you do not believe. And because of your lack of belief in the supreme deity, your actions collectively as a profession have severely harmed the living tree of the law. And the way that the legal profession has harmed the living tree of the law is by attempting to blot out the sun that feeds it, and that would be the recognized place that deity has. So is it any wonder that as the legal professionals of today continue to diminish God's place in the rule of law, that our rights, which in the Charter are founded on the supremacy of God, are deteriorating, right? Because the more that they diminish the rule, the place of God in law, the more the people's rights will be diminished, and the more their hunger and lust for power will be nourished. at the expense of the living tree of the law and the general population trying to live in peace underneath the safety of the living tree of the law. So this is a very, very serious issue. And you'll hear a lot of legal practitioners that will argue against this, but I would argue anybody arguing against the supremacy of God in law doesn't have business practicing law to begin with. That's fundamentally it. Like, you can't ethically practice in a system where you ignore what its foundations. You have no footing to practice at all. And one thing I'll point out here, because before I started my studies and practicings of the law, I kind of continued the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, which was, of course, scientifically demonstrating the existence of God. And I can do that for you very easily right here, right now. And of course, everything that I say, you can look up and verify for yourself, because I'm not full of shit. So, scientists, quantum physicists have come to something called the simulation theory, right? And the way that we arrived at the simulation theory is that we found that the mathematics that describe the movements of subatomic particles, okay, quarks, antiquarks, and protons, neutrinos, all those elements of the atom, we've found that the movements, the mathematics that we would use to describe the movements of the particles at the subatomic level are the same mathematical formula that we use to describe for web pages. So the physicists who are part of this kind of academic denial of divinity, because believing in God is stupid apparently, they go with, upon finding this evidence, right, of intelligent design to the reality, when they find the evidence for intelligent design, instead of pausing, meditating, contemplating, and reflecting upon what that could actually mean, they put out this chicken shit, maybe we live in a simulation, Okay, let's suppose that we do live in a simulation. That would mean that there's a programmer and a designer to the code, something that wrote all this code, right? Isn't that God? Now, I've heard arguments against, arguments for trying to strip God out of our constitution and our legal system because Canada is now a multicultural society. Well, there's nothing in a law and a set of laws founded on the supremacy of God, which would make the definition of God exclude Baha'u'llah, or Shiva, or Vishnu, or source energy in the universe, or, all of this stuff that we try and ascribe to God as a philosophical construct, I would say, is like the square root of -1. As mathematicians and as humans, we cannot fathom how we get to the square root of -1. But what we know is that when we accept on faith that the square root of -1 is a thing, is a value, that has let us develop all of the technology of the modern world. And so our legal system, being founded on the supremacy of God, doesn't necessarily mean the Judeo-Christian God. It could very well be the First Nations people's God. The point is, it is a neutral that all can agree on. And that's the thing about diplomacy that atheists do not understand. You have diplomacy through religion. Atheism is just communism, and that's just basically murder.